They come in the half-light. They move without sound. They stand close enough that the air tastes different. Small heads, dark faces like oiled stone, long, blunt fingers. The strange clinical light that seems to wash everything sterile and flat. Time thins and then folds. Minutes vanish, and people wake with clocks stopped and memories taped in fragments. Stay with us till the end. Subscribe and like if you value careful investigation. The story of these figures, known in popular imagination as the Greys, has been told and retold in hospitals, police reports, late-night radio shows, scholarly monographs, and leaked government files. Our task here is not to settle the ultimate question of their origin, but to trace the shape of the phenomenon, its repeated features, its most revealing cases, the physical traces reported by witnesses, and the competing frameworks that try to account for how and why these encounters happen. We will move from the archetype itself, appearance and behavior, to instances that have shaped the public image, to the medical and genetic themes that recur in testimony, and finally to the fraught intersection of secrecy, skepticism, and cultural meaning. Along the way, we will meet witnesses, clinicians, and investigators whose lives were altered in ways measurable and subtle. We will note where evidence is strong, where it is ambiguous, and where interpretation becomes imagination. The ending will not seal the matter. It will instead leave the pattern in view, with its edges still out of reach. The visual shorthand is nearly constant across decades and continents. Slight bodies, enlarged crania, eyes like dark almonds that reflect no light. Betty and Barney Hill described that silhouette in 1961 in New Hampshire. Betty later sketched the face that became an archetypal image. Barney recounted the outline of a craft low over the road. Their testimony, collected by investigators such as John Fuller and later re-examined by clinicians, contains details that would reappear in other accounts. Paralysis, bright interior lights, a sense of being examined. Betty Hill underwent a hypnotic regression years later. Those sessions, recorded and transcribed, produced dialogue that has both fascinated and infuriated skeptics who point to suggestion as a contaminant. Yet even before any publicized regression, local police logs and the Hills' own abrupt, unsettled behavior were documented. The Hill story functions as a hinge in the modern narrative, a case where ordinary life and an extraordinary claim met on a lonely road. The first thing to note about the Greys is their choreography. Witnesses rarely report a posture of overt hostility. More often, they describe clinical efficiency, a focus on procedure. In interviews compiled by researchers such as Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs, the beings tend to move with a measured, non-deferential rhythm, precise, almost indifferent. Contact begins with light and with freezing. Many accounts include a sudden weightlessness or an inability to move, as if the body had been reassigned a lower priority. Travis Walton, who in 1975 survived an alleged abduction in the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest and later wrote of bright light and unconsciousness, described waking aboard a craft to a sound he compared to a running refrigerator motor. He heard instructions that had no human cadence. His story, investigated by firefighters who knew him, reconstructed in polygraph reports, and told in his book Fire in the Sky, contains the kind of sensory oddities that anchor the phenomenon: mechanical hums, a persistent metallic austerity, odors he could not name but that felt clinical. Where physical traces are offered, they are often subtle and difficult to reconcile. Some cases present scars placed in unusual locations. Roger Lear, a podiatrist who later became a central figure in the implant narrative, reported removing several small metallic objects from patients who claimed they had been left by non-human actors. Lear's methodology, surgical extraction followed by laboratory analysis, produced materials that he and some collaborating labs described as anomalous. Critics pointed out the precarious chain of custody and the temptations of confirmation bias. Proponents argued that even ambiguous results demand study because material evidence is scarce. The tension between those who seek physical proof and the dearth of reproducible artifacts is one of the story's core pressures. Not all witnesses present the same emotional contour. Betty Hill expressed a ravenous curiosity she wanted to understand. Others, like some of the children in the 1994 Rua, Zimbabwe incident, documented by the late Dr. John Mack and subsequently filmed and analyzed by researchers, displayed clear fear. In Rua, a group of schoolchildren described a small, dark-skinned figure with large, luminous eyes stepping from a craft near their playground. Their teacher, Pamela, gave statements that were recorded by local reporters and later circulated internationally. The children's drawings and spontaneous descriptions, swinging feet, soft voices, sudden dryness in the throat, show recurrent motifs even in that moment of panic. The Rua case is often cited by proponents as particularly persuasive because it involved multiple, independent young witnesses and was observed in daylight. Skeptics counter that mass contagion of ideas among children is well documented, and that cross-cultural broadcast of gray imagery could shape expectation. Both points must be weighed. Repeated motifs can suggest a common external cause or a shared internal response to unusual stimuli. The clinical undertone of many narratives is impossible to ignore. Autopsies and testimony, the extraction of samples, examinations that feel like medical procedures. Accounts that involve reproductive themes are especially delicate, and the language used by survivors is cautious and clinical. Some women have reported missing time during pregnancies, or the disappearance of a pregnancy that later returns with signs suggestive of surgical intervention. Researchers such as David Jacobs have proposed a narrative in which hybridization plays a role, while other investigators emphasize psychosocial explanations, from sleep paralysis to elaborate confabulation under hypnosis. In every instance where reproductive questions arise, the evidence is personal, emotionally charged, and rarely conclusive. Survivors often undergo medical exams that document scars and, in rare cases, histological anomalies. Yet the same data can be read multiple ways, as proof of external intervention, as misinterpreted surgical outcomes, or as the corporeal residue of intense psychological stress. The grays themselves occupy an interpretive crossroads. Astronomers and exobiologists suggest an extraterrestrial origin as a straightforward hypothesis. A biological form evolved under different gravities and light regimes might produce the morphology described: large crania, reduced musculature, extensive neural tissue. But the absence of unambiguous physical delivery systems, of crash-retrieved biological specimens, and the sporadic geographic distribution of encounters complicate that hypothesis. Alternative frameworks exist. The interdimensional model treats the phenomenon as interactions with entities coexistent in overlapping layers of reality. Witnesses are left with experiential proof, but not with material artifacts readily verifiable by conventional means. The temporal or future human hypothesis frames grays as descendants of humankind who have adapted to different environmental pressures and who return across time to observe or intervene. Other analysts propose a synthetic agent model, drones or bioengineered proxies created by human or post-human actors to perform tasks beyond direct human sight. Each theory accounts for certain features while failing to account for others. Extraterrestrial origin accounts for physical plausibility but struggles with the socio-cultural variability of reports and with the limited material evidence. Interdimensionality accounts for the episodic, non-local quality of encounters but is metaphysically speculative. Synthetic agent models can explain material artifacts yet risk importing contemporary technological biases into descriptions that emerged decades before some of those technologies existed. We must also examine how the phenomenon interacts with institutional secrecy. Project Blue Book compiled thousands of reports mid-century and declared that few could be attributed to unknown craft. Yet the project's files are a patchwork of careful investigation and dismissive conclusion. The Roswell lore, military crash, charismatic leaks, and an enduring mythology of cover-up continues to color public perception, especially when invoked alongside documents like the Hotel Memo or alleged MJ-12 references. Area 51, whether or not it houses extraterrestrial hardware, functions as a spatial metaphor for state untransparency. Freedom of Information Act requests have yielded documents that excite as much as they frustrate, because the declassified papers often reveal human bureaucracy rather than smoking guns. Misfiled notes, radar blips, conflicting witness statements. To the public, silence and secrecy become as telling as admission. To the serious investigator, they are insufficient proof because 1,000 mundane reasons explain institutional opacity. The human cost of encounters can be measured in discrete and persistent ways. In numerous follow-ups, witnesses report sleep disturbances, intrusive imagery, flashbacks, and difficulty maintaining relationships. Some experience a kind of altered sensory baseline, lights that feel abrasive, sudden memories that cascade in mismatched orders, a belief that their bodies have been catalogued. The psychiatrist John Mack, who treated several alleged abductees, argued that these claims warranted compassionate clinical attention regardless of etiology. His work, which won both acclaim and scorn, insisted on listening first and theorizing later. Mack's clinical reports record patients who felt chosen, marked, or burdened. His critics accused him of legitimizing delusion. The tension between care and skepticism is central. Treating people with deference does not require accepting every factual claim uncritically. But it does demand that investigators account for the ways the experience alters lives. Consider a moment of reconstruction drawn from multiple sources. A farmhouse in rural New England. A late autumn night with frost on the grass. The house is a rectangle of warm light amid dark fields. A man named Thomas wakes to a humming sound, thicker than air. He notices his watch stopped and a film of silver dust on the doorknob. He walks barefoot across the cold kitchen tile and feels his limbs heavy, as if submerged. A disk of light presses against the window in the yard. Through the glass he sees a silhouette. Tall, disproportionate, eyes like wells. He says later, in a police statement dated and archived, that he smelled disinfectant and a faint metallic tang. The beings are near enough that the porch seems to flatten. He cannot call out. He remembers being on a surface that curved and smelled of ozone. He undergoes a medical exam hours later that notes a faint circular abrasion behind his ear, a lesion that the local physician records as superficial and puzzling. Years on, under hypnosis, Thomas recounts a sterile interior where needles and instruments gleam. Analysts will point to the suggestibility of hypnotic recall. Others see a congruence with broader patterns. The same hum, the same light, the same odd odor. The case becomes evidence in the vector field of a larger question. Cultural feedback cannot be ignored. The 1980s surge in gray imagery, through books such as Whitley Strieber's Communion, introduced millions to a particular face. Strieber's autobiographical account of encounters pressed the experience into the public mind as both intimate and horrifying. His phrasing, an evocative blend of dread and curiosity, helped a portion of vocabulary that witnesses then used. The possibility that media informs memory is real and should temper claims of purity in testimony. Yet some of the most compelling early cases predate the mass circulation of such imagery. This temporal overlap complicates simple contamination theories. Moreover, when multiple independent witnesses who had no obvious exposure to specific media constructs report congruent details, the argument for a shared cultural script becomes less definitive. It is here that the investigator must remain nimble, acknowledging the power of culture while weighing independent corroboration where it appears. Skeptical frames are necessary and robust. Sleep paralysis, with its classic pressure on the chest and hypnagogic hallucinations, explains some experiences convincingly. False memory formation under suggestive therapeutic practices explains others. Social contagion and the human propensity to patternize random events into stories explains still more. Cognitive scientists point to agency detection, a bias that interprets ambiguous stimuli as intentional agents, as a mechanism that could account for many encounters. Yet reductionist explanations sometimes strain against the texture of testimony in cases where physical traces and multiple witnesses exist. When children produce similar drawings immediately after an event, or when local law enforcement records anomalies coincident with witness reports, the simple dismissal risks appearing intellectually lazy. We must also consider the possibility that the grays are not a single thing, but a consistent experiential archetype produced by multiple underlying causes. Some meetings might be misinterpreted natural phenomena experienced during sleep transitions. Others might be elaborate hoaxes. A handful could reflect unknown terrestrial technology. And a still smaller subset, if one accepts the testimony at face value, could be interactions with non-human intelligences. The pluralistic view preserves nuance. The phenomenon resists a single monolithic explanation. As we move deeper into the record, we encounter cases whose complexity tightens the knot rather than loosening it. The Travis Walton incident, for instance, involves multiple contemporaneous witnesses, co-workers who saw a light and reported Walton's disappearance, followed by Walton's dramatic reappearance 5 days later. Investigations included polygraphs and public scrutiny. For some, the discrepancies in witness narratives and the pressures of fame and profit complicate the picture. For others, Walton's physical injuries and the corroboration by his peers form a cluster of facts that are hard to reduce. Similarly, the accounts from Brazil in the 1950s and 1960s, such as Antonio Vilas-Boas, who reported being taken aboard a craft and subjected to procedures, intersect with the cultural milieu of the time. Vilas-Boas's account included sexual elements that later commentators debated heavily. Analysts emphasize care in handling such testimony. The Brazilian cases also show how local cultural frames shape and are shaped by the phenomenon. Researchers who have pursued this material professionally do so with divergent methods. John Mack approached witnesses with open clinical curiosity, compiling rich narratives and advocating for psychological care. Bud Hopkins focused on physical trace evidence and the patterns in abduction narratives, asserting that cumulative similarity suggested an underlying reality beyond spontaneous invention. David Jacobs emphasized an intentionality and ongoing program of hybridization that, if true, would have staggering implications. Critics have accused these researchers of circularity, finding patterns because they expected them, and of methodological lapses such as uncontrolled hypnosis. Each critique matters. Each method sheds light in its own way. The most useful path may be methodological pluralism, combining clinical sensitivity, forensic rigor, sociological analysis, and cautious theorizing. Technology and craft descriptions pose another problem. Witnesses rarely converge on detailed schematics. Instead, they offer sensory impressions, a hum, a lack of seams, panels that glow with an internal light, an absence of familiar mechanical articulation. Some accounts include maps projected by slender fingers, or images impressed directly into the mind. These reports have given rise to theories about advanced propulsion, manipulation of gravity, field effects that short-circuit sensory perception, or about communication modes that bypass language. A pragmatic investigator might treat such claims as phenomenological. They tell us how visitors or witnesses experience the event, regardless of whether the underlying mechanics are physical, technological, psychological, or otherwise. At a certain point, the pattern formed by recurring symbols becomes meaningful in itself. The almond eyes, a face that refuses reflection and gives back a blank depth. The cold light, an illumination that reveals and removes warmth. Missing time, the erasure of minutes and hours that undermines a person's trust in their own chronology. These motifs create a symbolic grammar, and that grammar carries psychological weight. It asks, who is allowed to know whom? Who can peer into the private interior of our bodies and minds and leave without permission? Whether the agents behind those motifs are outsiders, future kin, or projections of deep cultural anxieties, the result is the same: a public vocabulary for fear, violation, and an uneasy intimacy. We will continue by examining several key files more closely: police reports, medical notes, polygraph transcripts, and the personal diaries of witnesses, and by tracing how these materials have been interpreted and reinterpreted over time. The next sections will reconstruct pivotal moments in fuller sensory detail, compare laboratory analyses of alleged implants, and assess the most persuasive and least persuasive theories side by side. In doing so, we aim neither to convert nor to refute, but to place the evidence on a sober table and see what pattern emerges under rigorous light. The police reports arrive first, thin manila envelopes stamped and annotated in cramped handwriting. They are not cinematic documents. They are fragments of procedure, a chronology of questions asked and answers recorded, the inventory of shoes, cigarette butts, and cigarette ash smeared on the rim of an interview room. Read straight through, they are maddeningly quotidian. The deputy's log of calls, the list of officers who went to the site, the notation that a witness appeared upset, the formal request that an ambulance stand by in case the subject appears with injuries. But those margins are where the human fact lies. A line that reads, "Subject reported missing time," is a bare bureaucratic marker, but when it sits beside a handwritten note, "Complainant smelled burning like hair," or "Subject's clothes hot to the touch," the ordinary record amplifies into something less ordinary. In the Walton folder, a deputy's inventory contains that odd mixture of the banal and the inexplicable. There are statements taken at the clearing, signatures and fingerprints, and a shorthand, "Intense light observed from clearing," that repeats like a litany across 6 pages of witness statements. The individual accounts diverge in small, telling ways. One man insists the object made no noise. Another records a humming like a transformer. One says the light was white. A second describes it as blue-white with a cold center. These differences are exactly what a sober investigator expects. They are also, paradoxically, the evidence. If the event is a hoax, its social texture would be different: staged positions, matching formulations, rehearsed vocabulary. Instead, the statements show the messy work of perception: what one man stood to see, where his view was blocked by the cab of the truck, how the angle of his stare turned a glare into a silhouette. Taken together, the reports create a 3-dimensional map of that clearing and the way it folded time. Medical notes compress the human body into shorthand, abbreviations, and measured intervals. A hospital triage sheet records vitals, pulse, blood pressure, temperature. A physician's scribble notes superficial burns, singed hair, small abrasions along the forearm. In some cases, there are photographs, blurry, clinical, a wrist with a pale concentric scar, a neck with redness that fans outward. But the signature detail is often in what is not on the chart. There are no massive fractures, no burns of the degree that one would expect from ordinary fire, no hemorrhaging to explain the delirium some witnesses reported. The physicality is real and real in its modesty. Small, localized effects that refuse easy explanation, yet resist dramatic extrapolation. Polygraph transcripts are perhaps the least satisfying documents for an outsider. They read like a machine's binary accounting of anxiety: fluctuations in respiration, galvanic skin response, pulse. For investigators and journalists, polygraphs have been double-edged. On the one hand, polygraph results lent weight to the testimony of several of Walton's co-workers. On the other, critics have pointed out the method's vulnerabilities: emotional arousal unrelated to deception, poor examiner technique, and the absence of a universally accepted standard for truth. In many cases, the transcripts provide more about the psychophysiological state of a witness during questioning than about the objective reality of the events. Where the transcripts were accompanied by recorded interviews, the combination becomes instructive: a voice that trembles while the polygraph register spikes, pauses that coincide with changes in skin conductance, a laugh that returns and calms the machine. When read carefully, the polygraphs situate testimony within the witness's emotional architecture. They do not grant a definitive seal of veracity. Personal diaries and private notebooks, when they turn up, are the most intimate files of all. A farmer's scrawl, 2 days after his harrowing encounter, will wander from logistical notes about harvest to a suddenly opened paragraph about seeing something not of this earth. A nurse will write a sentence. A brother will write, "I don't know what to say," and then, beneath it, a little sketch of the object his sister described. These are not evidence in the legal sense. They are evidence of someone trying, in private, to close a loop between the rational world and a particular encounter with dissonance. Diarists attempt to place their extraordinary experience in a household grammar: weather, supper, a child's cough, then the visitation. Reconstruction of pivotal moments requires us to move beyond the paper and into sensory imagination grounded in testimony. Here, then, is one such reconstruction, composed of composite elements drawn from witness accounts and the languages they used to describe themselves to authorities. They were 4 hours from the nearest light, the truck tires making a rhythmic slap against the dirt. The men's boots had the smell of diesel and sweat. One man had a cigarette between his lips when the light began. The opening becomes sound first in half the accounts. A hum like a transformer, low and constant, felt more than heard. Then the light, too bright to stare into, yet with a center that seemed to eat the shadows nearest it. The clearing around them, a ring of scrub pine, became a stage. A shape rose above the ground with no visible means of support, and the air changed. Temperature fell, hairs on the arms tightened, a pressure filled the sinuses as if one had stepped into a high vestibule of nitrogen. The men reacted as men do in such moments, first shock, then decisive action. One threw down the cigarette, another called a name. They moved toward the object, not in the coordinated lines of a film set, but in the staggered geometry of someone who has never rehearsed what to do. Then a sound, if sound it was, a slicing density that parted the syllables of the world. One man later described a taste like pennies, another a sensation of being observed and measured. Time, in those moments, does something odd to language. A witness will say, "I was out for 5 minutes" in one interview, and later insist it was 20 in a taped conversation, then add, "I lost hours, I woke up miles away." The narrative lapses clog the timeline, producing what witnesses label missing time. For some, the lacuna is small, minutes that refuse a coherent chain of memory. For others, it is an absence so total that their minds attempt to weld meaning into the break. Images recovered under hypnosis, dreams that feel like memory, scripts rehearsed in waking daylight. The way missing time is experienced is often more revealing than the arithmetic of its length. It shows the mind encountering a breach and working, sometimes awkwardly, to cross it. Implants and alleged foreign objects are a domain where laboratory science meets all the frailties of human testimony. The case files include photographs of small metallic slivers, X-rays showing faint opacities lodged beneath skin, and laboratory reports that plainly note the difficulty of drawing substantive conclusions from small samples. In several noted cases, physicians extracted objects through minor surgical procedures. Those specimens were then sent to independent laboratories. The tests applied were standard: optical microscopy to determine gross morphology, scanning electron microscopy, SEM, for surface topology, energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, EDX, for elemental composition, and, when possible, X-ray diffraction, XRD, for crystalline structure. What emerges from the reports is seldom the dramatic alien alloy of popular imagination. Many specimens prove to be simple metals: aluminum, copper, iron, sometimes with pitting, oxidation, and a surface film that could be biological in origin. In a subset of samples, trace elements, vanadium, titanium, nickel, appear in concentrations that spark interest precisely because they are not ubiquitous in kitchen scrap. Yet, when forensic chains of custody are imperfect, when contamination is possible, and when the specimen is too small for comprehensive isotopic analysis, the laboratory's voice becomes cautious. One report will read, "Specimen consistent with industrial-grade aluminum alloy, no evidence of machining marks," followed by a line about possible contamination with biological material. Another will state, "SEM shows unusual surface pitting and filamentous adherence consistent with dried organic matter." Such phrasing opens two conversational doors at once, one toward technological curiosity, the other toward mundane explanations. These mundane explanations deserve careful consideration. Aluminum fragments can be present in domestic settings: fence posts, discarded cans, insulation, the occasional shrapnel of a workshop. Organic matter clinging to metal can be environmental dust, dried blood, or extracellular matrix from connective tissue. Contamination can occur at any stage, during extraction in a field clinic, through the tray on which a sample is set, through the surgical instruments used to remove it, through the laboratory environment itself. The matter of contamination, in other words, is not a conspiracy theory. It is a mundane problem for any forensic scientist working with small, irregular samples. Yet some specimens resist the simple cause narrative. In at least a few documented instances, objects recovered from alleged abduction subjects contained microstructures that puzzled material scientists. Layered crystalline matrices, micron-scale voids aligned in non-random patterns, coatings that presented as neither pure oxide nor a familiar polymer. Those reports are rare, and they are controversial. Repeated independent testing is often absent, or, if present, yields ambiguous results. Even then, the findings are not proof of non-human origin. They are proof only that the laboratory could not, at that time and with those methods, comfortably assign the object to a known terrestrial provenance. To weigh those findings properly, method must be foregrounded. The strongest pattern in the files is not a single definitive piece of evidence, but the differentiation between rigorous, repeatable methodology and anecdotal forensic improvisation. The cases that deserve serious attention are those where extraction followed strict chain of custody protocols, where independent laboratories received labeled sealed samples, and where multiple analytical techniques converged on a consistent description. Where those conditions are present, the materials remain ambiguous but worth further study. Where protocols are missing, the interpretive burden shifts away from the specimen and back onto the socio-cultural and psychological fabric of the witness's life. Memory retrieval, and particularly the use of hypnosis, is one such locus of methodological dispute. A number of investigators turn to hypnosis as a tool to recover lost episodes. Hypnosis, in skilled hands, can be a means to access memories otherwise occluded by stress. But it is also a state of increased suggestibility. The transcripts of hypnotic sessions in the archives are revealing less for the content than for the process. The cadence of the hypnotist's voice, the leading prompts, and now tell me what you see, the moments when the subject offers a tableau that the interrogator echoes back as confirmation. Critics argue that these moments are where narratives become circular, where the investigator's expectations leak into the recovered memory, and sometimes this certainly occurs. Defenders reply that some recovered elements match independent physical traces, scars, garden tramples, small environmental details a witness could not otherwise have known. The truth again rests in the middle. Hypnosis can sometimes reveal real elements of an experience, but it can also create artifacts, and separating the two requires corroboration beyond the hypnotic transcript. Sociology and anthropology supply another interpretive lens. The language witnesses use is not culture-free. The almond eye motif, the cold light, the sense of an intruding observational gaze, these symbols do not appear in a vacuum. They intersect with prior cultural narratives, science fiction magazines, movies screened in drive-ins, the anxieties of the Cold War, the professionalization of ufology that created standard interview forms and a circulating vocabulary. Yet cultural embedding does not reduce the witness to a mere consumer of narratives. People's experiences are refracted through culture. The cultural images help them narrate the experience, but they do not, on their own, create the raw sensation of paralysis or the smell of hot metal on the skin. A vivid, contingent reality meets cultural grammar and is expressed through it. Take, by way of example, the Brazilian cases of the 1950s and 1960s. Villas-Boas's account, with its specific sequence, a beam of light, a boarding, a set of invasive procedures, came out of a milieu where science fiction was penetrating pulp literature, and where local cosmologies blended with imported ideas. Anthropologists note that the particular sexual elements in some reports intersected uneasily with Catholic moral frameworks and sparked both dismissal and eager sensationalism. The result, across decades, was that the stories were reframed constantly. A prize for the sensational press, a pathology for skeptics, a spiritual test for believers. The phenomenon changed the culture around it, and was, in turn, changed by that culture. Nor should we underplay the personal consequences. The files through which we move are full of collateral damage. Marriages strained, jobs lost, a subject who becomes unwillingly famous and finds his life reconstituted by other people's hypotheses. In those margins are letters of support, some desperate, some pragmatic, attempts by family members to anchor a loved one. In counseling notes, one reads the soft scaffolding of attempts to restore normalcy, sleep hygiene, group support, and invitation to mundane routines. For many, the social fallout is as devastating as the encounter itself. Whether the origin of the incident is corporeal, psychological, or cultural, the body and mind that come afterward must live in a world where the ordinary script no longer fits. The theoretical landscape remains broad and contested. The extraterrestrial hypothesis retains its intuitive appeal. It explains the otherness, the technological metaphors, the sense of being observed by an intelligence. The interdimensional hypothesis reframes the event as a border crossing between ontologies, our everyday reality and an adjacent layer in which different physical rules apply. The secret human technology hypothesis suggests clandestine experimentation, testing of aerospace technology that brushed against civilians. Psychological models emphasize dissociation, sleep paralysis syndromes, shared cultural narratives, and the mind's capacity to weave dreams into perceived memories. Each theory contends with particular empirical demands. Where are the material traces? Where are independent witnesses? What social incentives shape the testimony? No single model fits all of the files we have read. Each accounts better for certain elements than for others. If we judge these theories by predictive power, their ability to generate testable propositions, the hybrid program hypothesis, as argued by some researchers, stumbles at the same place as the most dramatic alien claims, the absence of an open, replicable mechanism. The interdimensional model is difficult to operationalize scientifically. The social-psychological model is more amenable to empirical studies, patterns of cultural diffusion, correlations with prior exposure to certain narratives, but less able to explain physical imprints. The secret human technology hypothesis demands political evidence of classified programs. Historically, governments have indeed run secret projects, but such projects leave material traces, training ranges, procurement records, contractors. And the investigators who have searched for such traces find little support beyond the occasional suggestive coincidence. At the end of this phase of the inquiry, what is most persuasive is not a single theory, but a methodological principle. The cases that resist easy explanation are those where multiple evidentiary strands converge. Witness testimony, contemporaneous third-party observation, physical traces subject to independent analysis, and medical documentation consistent with acute physiological disturbance. Where the evidence is thin, single-source testimony uncorroborated by physical traces, or where experimental conditions were permissive to suggestion, the need for caution increases. The next cluster of files begin to narrow focus on such convergences. A laboratory report declares its limited scope and then proceeds to catalog minute features with the care of a taxonomist. A physician's letter, written years after an event, lists persistent symptoms, sleep disruption, sudden phobias, a localized dermatological anomaly, and ties them, clinically, to a state of post-traumatic stress rather than to an obvious somatic assault. A polygraph for one witness shows coherence across items about what they saw, but reveals elevated responses to questions about motive and consequence, signs that the social implications of having seen the thing matter as much as the seeing itself. We close one file and open another, and the scene shifts, but not the pattern. Each document is a prism that refracts the event into lines of interpretation. The task is to hold those lines together long enough to see where they intersect and where they diverge. From that cross-hatching, a picture begins to take shape.
partial, contested, and stubbornly resistant to final verdict. In the coming pages, we will follow a few of those intersections in greater detail. We will trace a physician's note back to the person it describes, read the diary that sat unread in a bedside drawer for decades, and compare the laboratory's cautious language to the image a witness carries in memory. We will test theories by running them against the most stubborn manifestations: the unexplained burn that left a hexagonal scar, the witness whose chronicle of events is matched by a neighbor's truck log, the specimen that under SEM looks both familiar and oddly structured. The case files do not yield a single truth, but if examined closely, they reveal the architecture of a phenomenon that calls for interdisciplinary humility, a mixture of materiality and meaning, of event and narrative, of body and story. For now, the reader should imagine the investigator at a long table scattered with folders, the low hum of a fluorescent light, the late hour, and the slow, stubborn act of evidence.
One folder is thicker, its contents dog-eared and marked with sticky notes. Another is cuffed with a rubber band that has lost its stretch. A pencil falls and rolls to the floor. The investigator lifts a page, reads a line, and pauses, then turns to the next page. The investigator reads on. The physician's letter is careful in the way of physicians: measured words, diagnostic codes, judicious hedges. It catalogues symptoms across years: fractured sleep, sudden aversions to open skies, an intolerance to electrical hums described by the patient as a needle under the skin. There is an entry about a localized dermatological finding, photographed and dated 3 months after the reported event. A shallow, polygonal scar, edges slightly raised, center pale and smooth. The doctor writes that he could not ascribe it to a known burn pattern, that biopsies showed only nonspecific fibrosis and superficial epidermal loss, and that the patient's cortisol levels were intermittently elevated in the months that followed. He concludes, politely, professionally, that the constellation of signs best fit a chronic stress disorder with concomitant somatic manifestations, and he recommends cognitive therapy and sleep regulation. A loose photograph falls from the letter when the investigator turns the page. The image is small, cut from a glossy print. The scar, centered on a wrist, its outline a near-perfect hexagon. The skin around it bears the pale gloss of healed tissue. A faint ring of pigment marks the periphery. Someone has written on the back in a hurried hand, "Not heat, no soot." The investigator holds the photo up to the lamp and notes, as the physician did, how familiar the body is, how ordinary the arm, the room behind it in the picture. Yet the shape is wrong, like a punctuation mark misplaced on a page. He follows the file to the bedside diary, which arrived sealed in an envelope and later described in an inventory. Personal notes recovered, subject to redaction. The diary sits in the folder now, its cover leather soft and the edges of pages browned. There is a date on the first entry, 2 days before the reported sighting, and then a rhythm of entries that becomes increasingly fragmented. At first, domestic details: a recipe tried and failed, a neighbor's borrowed ladder, the small victory of a houseplant that had not died. Then the writing slips into minutes, as if the author found the habit of recording breathed space to contain the day's anxieties. Noise at 2:12 a.m., like a refrigerator far away. Light? No, not light. Pressure in the teeth. There are lists scratched in the margins: what to pack, where to go, who to call. And on the page after, a single line repeated 3 times in different pens: I saw it. I saw it. I did not imagine it. The last complete entry is a narrative snatch, vivid and simple. A small house, a truck idling on the lane, a neighbor leaning out of his cab who says he thinks there's something in the field. The author writes about stepping out in bare feet into a cold that did not come from the air. It was like the night had turned its inside out, she writes. It made the dog cry. The entry ends with a line that dissolves into an ink blot, a smear shaped like a triangle. The page after is torn away. The investigator cross-references the diary with the neighbor's log, which is, in practice, a paper ledger kept by the trucker. Stamp marks of time and dates, a string of short entries about deliveries, diesel purchases, and hours worked. The ledger contains a notation for the night in question, a short delay while a local farmer flagged him down for help.
There is a time entry that places the truck at a standstill 3 fields down at precisely the minute the witness's diary cites an appearance. The trucker wrote, as he later told a detective, that he had stopped because a woman had run into the road waving. He notes a faint circular burn on his fender the next day that he thought at the time came from a stray ember. For the investigators who originally compared these records, the coincidence of timestamps seemed not definitive proof of anything, but a corroborative pin, not a spike of certainty, but an anchor, holding 2 narratives near one another. Then there is the lab report, the document that warrants the thickest caution. The laboratory notes its limitations at the top of the page: small sample, possible contamination, the procedures used, and their detection limits. The specimen submitted is described tersely: an epiphenomenal fragment scraped from the periphery of the lesion, collected under sterile conditions and stored in an amber vial. Under light microscopy, it appears fibrous, translucent in parts, with regions of granular opacity. Under scanning electron microscopy, the sample acquires the qualities of an argument. At higher magnification, a repeating honeycomb matrix emerges, but its struts are not biological chitin in the common sense. There is a microstructural order, crystalline seams along some filaments, and micropitting that suggests irradiation or high-energy deposition. Elemental analysis returns low concentrations of iron and traces of titanium. The lab cautions that such signals can result from environmental contamination and suggests further testing. The language of the report hovers between curiosity and prudence. Unusual nanoscale morphology, it says. Resembles arthropod exoskeleton in macro pattern, but chemical composition and seam structure are anomalous. It proposes hypotheses and immediately declines to weight any of them. Thermal decomposition, exotic contamination, deliberate manufacture at microscale. The conclusion reads like a conversation held with oneself. No conclusive origin determined. Recommend targeted isotopic analysis and comparison with control samples from local flora and manufactured polymers. Interpretation remains tentative. There is a footnote. The lab requests a chain of custody clarification and mentions that the sample's container bore residues of a petroleum solvent used commonly in field extractions, which complicates surface readings. Practicalities intrude, the ordinary mess that attends extraordinary claims. When the investigator reads the list of recommended next steps, he makes
a small notation in his own hand. Request full SEM stack. Compare with truck fender scrap. Interview lab tech present. Between the formal documents, the human material accretes. The physician's letter is followed by a 1-page affidavit from a sister who describes the patient's withdrawal from the community, an avoidance of verandas and markets, a new habit of drawing curtains before sunset. A school teacher writes of the child of the witness who began to speak of shadows that sat on the stairs, and an employer files a brief note noting absenteeism and a decline in reliability. None of these are proof of a visitation. They are the wake that follows a disruptive event, the ordinary ways life rearranges itself around a rupture. The investigator sets the photographs back into the folder and slides the diary into a manila sleeve. He lingers over a small note attached with a paperclip, a telephone number scrawled in desperation, followed by the name L. Mercer. The paper is thin, the ink is faded at the edges. He imagines the person who scribbled it, the late-night caller, the neighbor, the doctor reaching for someone to help make sense of a wound that does not fit the ordinary ledger of human harm. Outside the window, the parking lot is emptying. The fluorescent hum that fills the office seems to diminish in pitch as the hour advances. He pockets the number. He closes the folder gently, as though to keep the pieces from spilling further, and stands. The lamp throws a narrow pool of light across the table, throwing long fingers onto the rubber bands and sticky notes. For a moment, he regards the hexagonal print in the photograph again, and the words of the medical report. Post-traumatic stress with somatic sequelae. Then, like a modest plan forming from a larger map, he lays out the next tasks. Call the lab. Compare the trucker's ledger with the vehicle's maintenance log. Find the missing page of the diary at the bedside site. Ask the physician for raw biopsy slides. He walks to the door holding the folder and the photograph. The late hour makes the corridor feel smaller, the building quieter, yet the files left on the table behind him remain in their careful disarray.
A pencil rolled to the floor, a manila tab peeking out where another page awaits. He flips off the lamp as he exits, and the table recedes into shadow. The investigator steps already thinning toward the car, toward the road that will lead him back to the farm, to the trucker's ledger, to the lab that will run the isotopic assays. He thinks, as he closes the office door, that the work ahead will require the patience of a taxonomist and the humility of a reader confronted with a stubborn sentence. The files have produced patterns, intersections of time and mark, but they insist on being read slowly, on being tested against too many skeptical instruments to count as explanation. There is a photograph taped to the inside
cover of the largest folder, a close-up of the wound that the witness carried home like a small, peculiar compass. Beneath it, someone has written, "Start here." He takes the folder down the stairwell and into the night. The road to the farm is a black ribbon. The world seems to have retreated to a single, resolute point of inquiry. He thinks of the specimen under the microscope, so ordinary in its oddity, and of the diary's torn page. The next morning will be a dozen small interrogations, a phone call to the lab director, coffee with the trucker, a visit to the house where the diary sat. The intersection of documents has been located. The work now is to follow it outward, along time-stamped edges, until the sliver of convergence either widens or thins. He slides into his car and drives toward the farm lights, the folder a modest weight in his lap, the soft hum of the engine a different kind of steady. The files will not surrender a single neat truth. They will, if he is careful, tell a story complicated enough to be true.